So I want you to picture this. It's January 2026. A massive cargo ship docks in a major Western port.
Right, just a standard commercial delivery.
Exactly. And the containers on board are packed with advanced third-generation solar components, highly sophisticated telecommunications electronics.
Really high-value stuff.
Oh, incredibly high value. But here's the kicker. The buyer and the seller of these goods, they have just pulled off what a lot of analysts would call like the ultimate geopolitical heist.
Because they completely bypassed the U.S. dollar.
Completely. I mean, they settled this entire multi-million-dollar transaction using a decentralized digital currency. It was entirely outside the traditional banking system.
So no New York correspondent banks involved at all?
None. No SWIFT messaging, just a completely dollar-free supply chain. From the outside, it looks like a total flawless victory against U.S. financial dominance.
Yeah, the dream of the global South, right?
But, well, I know there's a catch here. A massive catch. The cargo ship isn't allowed to unload. The goods are entirely impounded, seized right there at the dock. And honestly, this is the part that genuinely stumped me at first.
It's the port seizure paradox.
Right. Because they bypass the dollar, the money is completely clean, it's untraceable by Western banks. So why on earth is the physical cargo frozen?
Well, it's because the physical goods hit a legal wall that the digital currency could, easily bypass.
Okay, so the money made it through the digital tunnel, but the goods got stuck at the physical border.
Exactly. While the buyer and seller successfully evaded the U.S. financial system, they couldn't evade United States intellectual property enforcement or supply chain compliance laws.
So it's not about the money at all.
No, the cargo isn't frozen because of how it was paid for. It's frozen because a patent royalty wasn't cleared, or maybe a supply chain provenance rule just wasn't met.
Okay, let's really unpack this because the implications here for you listening are just massive.
Right.
Are you saying that all this traditional panic over the death of the petrodollar is kind of missing the point?
I think it absolutely misses the point, yeah.
Because if you can bypass the dollar but still get your goods seized at the port, where does the actual power reside? Like, who actually has the leverage?
Right, the power isn't vanishing, it's not evaporating, it is simply relocating. I mean, we are witnessing a fundamental geographic and structural shift in global hegemony.
From the dollar to what?
From resource extraction to IP. Think about it. For 50 years, we lived in a unipolar financial order based almost entirely on pricing fossil fuels in a single currency.
The petrodollar system.
Exactly. But we are now rapidly moving into a multipolar system based on digital sovereignty, technological innovation, and crucially, who controls the foundational intellectual property of the future economy.
So the enforcement of IP and trade law is basically becoming the new reserve currency.
That's exactly how you should think about it. The patent dollar, if you will.
And that right there is our mission for this deep dive. Welcome to the conversation. Today, we are popping the hood on this massive silent shift in global power.
It's a shift that affects literally everything, from energy grids to smartphone prices.
Totally. We're looking at the transition from the petrodollar to this new patent dollar reality. And just as a quick ground rule for today's dive, for you listening, we are going to be examining some intensely ruthless strategies today.
From both Washington and Beijing, neither side is playing nice.
Right. We're talking about aggressive sovereign asset seizures, massive state-engineered market collapses, legal warfare. So to understand where the power is moving, I think we have to establish where it has lived for the last half century, the petrodollar.
The old engine.
Exactly. How did this specific mechanism of global control actually function? And why is it breaking down right in front of us?
So to really grasp the mechanics, we have to look back at the macroeconomic architecture established in the 1970s.
Post-Bretton Woods, right?
Yeah. Prior to 1971, the global economy ran on the Bretton Woods system. The U.S. dollar was pegged to gold, and other currencies were pegged to the dollar.
But then Nixon shocked the world and took us off the gold standard.
Because of mounting deficits, yeah. So suddenly, the dollar needed a new structural anchor. It couldn't just float on nothing. And it found that anchor in 1974 through a strategic alignment with Saudi Arabia.
And by extension, the rest of the OPEC nations. So walk me through the actual mechanics of that deal, because, we hear a petrodollar thrown around constantly, but how does it physically force the world to use American currency?
The arrangement was brilliantly simple in its coercion, honestly. The United States provided political support, military hardware, and security guarantees to Gulf monarchies.
The U.S. military basically becomes the security guard for the region.
Precisely. And in exchange, Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars.
Wow. Okay, so because every nation on Earth requires petroleum to industrialize, to transport goods, power their grids.
Every nation on Earth suddenly required a constant, massive supply of U.S. dollars just to keep the lights on.
So let's say I'm Japan or France in the 1980s. I can't just buy oil from the Saudis with yen or francs. I have to go out into the foreign exchange market, trade my domestic currency for U.S. dollars, and then hand those dollars to Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. Which creates a permanent artificial demand for American paper.
It's forced demand.
It's continuous structural global demand. But the true genius of the system, and really the source of American financial hegemony, was the second half of the loop.
The recycling phase.
Right. Saudi Arabia and other oil exporters accumulated massive, massive dollar surpluses. I mean, they couldn't practically spend all those billions on domestic infrastructure. They had too much money.
So what do they do with the excess dollars?
They recycled them back into Western financial markets, primarily by purchasing U.S. Treasury securities.
Let me stop you there, because for me, that is the crucial moment of this whole era. The world is forced to buy dollars to buy oil. The oil producers take those dollars and lend them right back to the U.S. government by buying bonds.
Right back into Washington's pockets.
The world is essentially forced to finance the United States national debt.
Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. He was the French finance minister back in the 1960s. He called it an exorbitant privilege.
That is the perfect term for it.
It really is. It allowed the United States to run massive, persistent trade and government deficits without suffering the massive inflation or currency devaluation that would ruin literally any other nation.
Because the U.S. could just externalize its inflationary pressures. It could sustain these expansive military commitments worldwide simply because the rest of the world was trapped in this petrodollar loop.
Exactly. And this is the crux of it. That loop is fracturing now.
We're seeing it everywhere. Countries are actively building bilateral currency settlements.
Russia and China trading in rubles and yuan.
Yeah.
India buying oil in rupees.
And China rolling out CIPS, right, the cross-border interbank payment system. It's a direct alternative to the Western SWIFT messaging network.
So the rest of the world is basically building an exit door from the dollar.
So how is the United States reacting to this structural fracture? Because they aren't just sitting back and watching it happen, right?
Oh, absolutely not. They are reacting with unprecedented economic warfare. When the structural demand for your currency wanes naturally, you have to enforce its usage through coercion.
Can you give a concrete example from the sources?
The most striking empirical evidence of this shift is the January 2026 intervention in Venezuela. Under Executive Order 14373, the United States seized administrative control over Venezuelan state assets.
In what amounts to an economic receivership, right?
Exactly.
Explain the mechanics of an economic receivership to me, because that sounds like a bankruptcy term. It doesn't sound like a geopolitical maneuver. How does a sovereign nation get put into receivership?
Well, normally, when Venezuela sells oil on the global market, the payment goes to accounts controlled by the Venezuelan central bank. That's standard sovereign commerce.
Right, they sell oil, they get paid.
But Executive Order 14373 intercepts that flow entirely. It mandates that the proceeds from Venezuelan oil sales moving through any financial institution that touches the U.S. system.
Which is almost all of them if it's in dollars.
Right. Those proceeds must flow directly into accounts controlled by the United States Treasury.
Wait, really? So the sovereign government of Venezuela sells a physical barrel of oil, but the money for that barrel is physically rerouted by U.S. banks into an escrow account in Washington.
That's the mechanism.
That means the acting government essentially has to ask the U.S. Treasury for an allowance to buy medicine or, fund infrastructure for its own citizens.
It is a profound confiscation of sovereign wealth. But here is the critical analytical takeaway for our deep dive. Actions like the Venezuelan receivership are symptoms of a declining monetary order.
Not a robust one.
Exactly. When the petrodollar system was secure, it relied on routinization. Everyone used it because it was just the easiest, most liquid way to do business.
It was convenient.
Right. When a hegemon has to resort to overt confiscation, and comprehensive asset seizures to maintain control, it demonstrates that the foundational organic demand for the currency is facing severe limits.
It sounds to me like the US dollar is an aging, massive toll booth sitting on the only highway in town. For decades, everyone just paid the toll to move their goods.
Because they had no other choice.
Right. But now the BRICS nations and the global south are finally figuring out how to build side roads. They're driving around the toll booth.
And the U.S. realizes they can't force everyone back onto the old highway.
So they aren't even trying to rebuild the old toll booth. They are moving the toll booth directly to the destination.
That's a great way to put it.
They are building a customs firewall around the technology and the intellectual property that the world actually needs to function in the 21st century.
That metaphor captures the strategic pivot perfectly. Oil denomination was the heart of the old system. The new system is defined by who owns the foundational patents for the post-carbon economy.
Which brings up the trillion-dollar question. If the new toll booth is intellectual property and the new battleground is green technology, who is actually winning that race right now?
Let's look at the hard data from our sources regarding the traditional titans of the oil era. Saudi Aramco versus ExxonMobil.
Yeah, because if anyone is going to cling to the old petrodollar system, you'd think it would be them. They built it.
You'd think so, but the divergence in R&D strategy between those two entities is just staggering. In 2022, Saudi Aramco filed an astonishing 963 U.S. patents.
963 in 1 year.
In 1 year. They tied for the top spot for all patent recipients in the Houston area, which, as you know, is the absolute heart of the American energy sector.
Now look at ExxonMobil. What did they do?
In that same year, Exxon received only 281 U.S. patents, and that actually represented an 8% decline from their previous year.
Okay. Almost 1,000 patents for the Saudi state oil company and under 300 for the American giant. That's not just a marginal difference in R&D budgets.
No, it represents a completely different corporate philosophy.
But what are they actually patenting? I mean, they can't be patenting 1,000 new ways to drill an oil well.
They aren't. And this is where it gets fascinating. Aramco is aggressively patenting software and digital infrastructure.
Software? An oil company?
Yes. Specifically, they are heavily focused on advanced energy settlements and digital grid technologies. They are actually patenting the blockchain applications required to manage decentralized microgrids.
Okay, wait, I need an ELI 5 on advanced energy settlements. What does that actually mean in the real world for, a normal person?
Imagine a neighborhood in the near future where every house has solar panels and a battery wall.
Okay, a decentralized grid.
Right. Sometimes your house produces more power than you need, so you sell the excess to your neighbor whose battery happens to be empty.
Makes sense.
But that transaction doesn't happen through a centralized utility company sending a monthly bill in the mail. It happens instantaneously, peer-to-peer, via a blockchain ledger that automatically records the transfer of energy and settles the payment in a digital currency.
So Aramco is patenting the software architecture that makes those peer-to-peer microgrid settlements possible.
Exactly. They are patenting the digital infrastructure of the future grid.
Wow. So Saudi Arabia sees the writing on the wall. They know the era of pumping liquid hydrocarbons out of the sand and pricing them in dollars is slowly sunsetting.
And they're adapting incredibly fast.
Aramco is systematically transforming itself into a highly diversified technology company that just happens to currently sell oil. By controlling the patents, copyrights, and trade secrets, the high edges of the smile, U.S. firms can offshore the low-profit, physically intensive manufacturing to the global south.
Ah, I see.
They let other nations deal with the slim margins of factory labor while retaining the high-profit, human capital-intensive IP rights at home.
So instead of extracting wealth by controlling the physical oil, they're extracting wealth by controlling the legal rights to produce goods. It's a transition from physical rent extraction to intellectual rent extraction.
Yes, that's exactly it. And this brings us to how the international rules-based order was actively constructed to facilitate this new form of hegemony. The defining architecture here, highlighted in the academic sources, is the 1994 TRIPS Agreement.
TRIPS. The agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights.
Yes.
This was a massive part of the creation of the World Trade Organization, right? The stated goal was to harmonize intellectual property laws globally.
That was certainly the diplomatic framing, yes. But the sources highlight a much darker reality for developing nations. Prior to TRIPS, Many developing nations didn't recognize patents on pharmaceuticals or critical agricultural chemicals, believing these were essential public goods.
You just treated them as open science.
Right. But TRIPS established global minimum standards for the protection of intellectual property, effectively forcing developing nations to adopt the stringent patent laws of advanced Western economies. The sources argue this legally locked the Global South into a dependency trap.
And the data on that trap is alarming. The Carnegie Endowment report in your stack notes a devastating statistic. While global trade expanded massively over the last few decades and wealth generation skyrocketed overall, Africa's share of global trade actually dropped.
Sobering statistic.
It went from 4.4% in 1970 to just 2.7% in 2020.
And that is the practical macroeconomic outcome of a system where you are legally barred from moving up the value chain. If the technology you need to industrialize, whether it's advanced fertilizers, medical treatments, or clean energy infrastructure, is locked behind exorbitant patent licensing fees, you remain a perpetual consumer rather than a producer. They want to own the digital toll booth for the decentralized energy grids of the future.
The contrast is stark. While Aramco is securing the IP for the post-carbon future, traditional Western majors like Exxon have historically focused their R&D heavily on maximizing short-term extraction efficiencies.
Squeezing the last drops out of the old system. Okay, so that's the software side of the energy transition. Let's look at the actual hardware, solar power. Because the numbers here from the sources are even more dramatic.
They really are. The shift in solar manufacturing is historic.
In 2004, China held a pretty minor 13% share of global solar patent applications. They were a secondary player. Japan was dominating with around 43%. But fast forward to 2024, China's share of global solar patents hasn't just grown, it has exploded to 65% of all applications worldwide.
And we need to be incredibly clear about the quality of those patents, too. This isn't just low-level manufacturing processes for cheap silicon panels.
It's not just assembly line tech.
Right. China completely dominates the frontier of third-generation solar technologies. They currently hold 70% of global patents for perovskite solar cells.
I've seen perovskite mentioned constantly in tech journals lately, but walk me through the mechanics of it. Why is it considered the holy grail of solar?
So, traditional silicon solar panels have a theoretical efficiency limit. It's just physics. They can only convert a certain percentage of sunlight into electricity before they max out, which is usually around the high 20% range.
Okay, so you hit a ceiling with silicon.
Exactly. Perovskite is a different class of crystalline materials that can be engineered to absorb completely different spectrums of light than silicon. The real breakthrough is creating what's called a tandem cell.
Which means combining them.
Yes. Layering a highly engineered thin film of perovskite directly on top of a traditional silicon base.
Ah, I get it. So the perovskite catches the light spectrum. The silicon misses, and the silicon catches whatever passes through the perovskite.
Precisely. It basically shatters the previous efficiency ceilings. Recently, the Chinese firm LONGi Green Energy achieved a world record 34.85% conversion efficiency in a perovskite silicon tandem cell.
34.85%. That's a massive jump from the mid-20s.
It changes the entire economic calculus of a solar farm. It means you generate vastly more power with the exact same land footprint.
But how did China engineer this monopoly? I mean, going from 13% to 65% of global patents and dominating the cutting-edge chemistry, that doesn't just happen by accident. How did they capture the entire future of the sun?
It was forged through a brutal economic crucible, a process that the Chinese government officially terms involution.
Involution? That sounds like a biological term, like, I don't know, an organ shrinking in on itself.
Yeah, it's a very evocative word. In the context of Chinese industrial policy, involution means intense, hyper-accelerated, and often completely ruinous domestic competition.
Ruinous for the companies involved.
Exactly. Following Beijing's 2020 dual carbon pledge, which was their commitment to peak carbon emissions and eventually achieve carbon neutrality, local and provincial governments flooded the domestic solar industry with capital.
They just opened the fire hose.
They showered startups and established firms alike with free land, massive tax holidays, and incredibly cheap state-backed financing incentives.
Basically giving unlimited ammunition to anyone who wanted to build a solar factory.
That's a great analogy. This drew in hundreds of billions in capital and triggered a fierce race-to-the-bottom price war among domestic Chinese firms. It was an absolute bloodbath for profit margins.
I can imagine. If everyone has free money to build factories, supply explodes.
Right. To give you a sense of the scale, the price of polysilicon, which is the foundational raw material for solar cells, It plunged by over 70% in 2023.
70% in 1 year.
And then it fell another 40% in 2024. Finished solar module prices collapsed globally because Chinese firms were producing at such a massive subsidized scale just to try and wipe out their domestic competitors.
So involution means engineering a domestic cage match. You fund 100 companies, you let them tear each other apart with vicious price wars, and the 3 or 4 mega corporations that actually survive the carnage are lean, ruthlessly efficient, and possess an insurmountable scale advantage over the rest of the planet.
That is the exact mechanism, and the results are undeniable. By surviving that domestic involution, Chinese firms scaled up to the point where they now produce 93.2% of the world's polysilicon.
Wow.
And 96.6% of the world's solar wafers.
96.6%. Let's just pause on that. That isn't a market share. That is a global chokehold.
Yes, it is.
Which brings us to a massive geopolitical problem. What does this mean for the United States or Europe trying to transition to green energy? Because I'm looking at these numbers and I'm seeing a severe technological lock-in.
The lock-in is absolute at this point. When one nation controls the raw materials, the manufacturing scale, and the cutting-edge tandem cell patents, the rest of the world faces a stark mathematical reality.
The numbers just don't lie.
Let's look at the actual costs of deployment. Even with massive, unprecedented domestic subsidies in the United States, like the billions injected through the Inflation Reduction Act to stimulate domestic manufacturing, the cost disparity remains staggering.
How big of a gap are we talking about?
After accounting for various tariffs and subsidies, a U.S.-made solar module sits at roughly 41 cents per watt. The Chinese equivalent. It costs about 9 cents per watt.
9 cents versus 41 cents. It's not even close. You can't compete with that on a free market.
You can't. It forces a geopolitical choice. Dependency or delay. If a Western nation wants to meet its climate targets, lower energy costs for its citizens, and deploy green infrastructure affordably, they are mathematically forced to rely on Chinese supply chains and Chinese intellectual property.
Because doing it domestically is just too expensive.
Right. If they attempt to build a completely indigenous, non-Chinese supply chain from scratch, the 41 cent per watt reality will severely delay their energy transition, and massive inflation will hit the energy sector.
Okay, I'm going to stop here and stress test this because the narrative we're building right now is heavily lopsided. If China holds an absolute monopoly on solar technology manufacturing and they make it for a quarter of the price, and Saudi Arabia is out-patenting U.S. oil giants in grid technology, the free market dictates that the U.S. loses this transition. Hasn't the U.S. already lost the techno-economic war?
If you are looking purely at factory floor output and R&D volume, that is the logical assumption. But that analysis misses a crucial dimension of infrastructural power.
Okay, what are we missing?
Filing a patent, or even manufacturing a cheap solar panel, is only half the battle. The true power, the power that allows a nation to dictate terms, extract wealth, and control global value chains, lies in the legal architecture required to enforce those patents and govern access to consumer markets.
The legal architecture.
Yes. The United States realizes it cannot win on the factory floor anymore, so it is shifting the battleground entirely to the courtroom and the border.
The customs firewall we mentioned earlier.
Exactly. This brings us directly to the formidable U.S. enforcement stack. The United States is activating unprecedented legal mechanisms to neutralize the manufacturing advantages of its geopolitical rivals.
Let's really break down these mechanisms because this is where the geopolitics gets visceral. How is the U.S. surviving the 9 cent versus 41 cent math without totally destroying its own energy grid?
One of the most potent weapons in this new legal stack is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or UFLPA.
Now, on the surface, that sounds like a human rights bill.
On the surface, it is. But structurally, in terms of trade mechanics, it functions as a massive asymmetric trade barrier. The UFLPA established a legal concept known as a rebuttable presumption.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It presumes by default that any goods mined, produced, or manufactured wholly or in part in China's Xinjiang region are produced with forced labor and are therefore strictly prohibited from entering the United States.
And here's the geographical trap, right? Xinjiang produces nearly half of the world's global supply of polysilicon, the foundation of every solar panel.
Exactly. The geography is highly intentional. But the truly radical part of the UFLPA is the phrase rebuttable presumption.
How does that change traditional customs law?
In traditional customs law, the burden of proof is on the state. If U.S. Customs wants to seize your shipment, they have to prove it violates the law. The UFLPA completely inverts that dynamic.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it is no longer up to U.S. Customs to prove your solar panel was made with forced labor. It is up to you, the importer, to prove by clear and convincing evidence that it wasn't.
I want to paint a picture of what that actually means for like a corporate compliance officer, because clear and convincing evidence isn't just a signed piece of paper saying, we promise it's clean. If I am importing a shipment of LONGi solar panels into Los Angeles, what do I actually have to prove to the customs agent?
You have to provide absolute, unbroken supply chain traceability down to the molecular level.
The molecular level? Are you serious?
I'm completely serious. You have to prove where the metallurgical grade silicon was smelted. You have to trace that silicon back to the specific quartz mine it was extracted from.
That sounds impossible.
It practically is. You need shipping logs, factory audits, and worker contracts for every single node in the supply chain, proving that not a single gram of material passed through Xinjiang. And because the Chinese domestic polysilicon market is deeply, deeply integrated, sorting clean silicon from Xinjiang silicon is like trying to separate a single drop of dye after it's been stirred into a glass of water.
That is the ultimate guilty until proven innocent standard for global trade. It turns a logistical problem into an insurmountable compliance barrier. It's not a tariff you can just pay your way through. It's a structural blockade.
It acts as a massive friction mechanism. It slows down the deployment of cheap Chinese tech and buys crucial time for domestic U.S. manufacturing to scale up.
But the enforcement stack doesn't stop at the border, right? There's also the PIPA, the Protecting American Intellectual Property Act.
Right, and this is even more aggressive.
Let's look at the PIPA, because the sources we are analyzing describe this as a complete paradigm-shifting piece of legislation. What does it actually authorize the U.S. government to do?
PIPA grants the President of the United States the statutory authority to impose devastating economic sanctions on any foreign individual or entity involved in the significant theft of U.S. trade secrets.
Devastating how?
We're talking about blocking all property transactions within U.S. jurisdiction, directing the Export-Import Bank to deny credit, and most importantly, placing companies on the dreaded BIS entity list.
Now, for those who don't follow export controls religiously, being placed on the Bureau of Industry and Security's entity list is essentially a corporate death sentence, right?
It is economic exile. It legally cuts you off from purchasing any U.S. technology software or using U.S. financial rails.
But the mechanism that makes PAPA truly terrifying for foreign companies and what fundamentally alters the global legal landscape here is the standard of proof required to trigger it.
Exactly.
I read this in our notes, and I actually had to read it twice to make sure I understood it. Walk me through the threshold for execution here.
PAPA allows the president to execute these sanctions with zero judicial determination.
Wait, no judge, no jury?
No trial, no civil judgment, no independent tribunal, and no requirement to present public evidence that a theft even occurred.
That is wow.
The executive branch can simply make an internal determination that a foreign entity poses a threat to U.S. intellectual property and drop the hammer.
That is staggering. A foreign competitor could wake up on a Tuesday and find themselves completely locked out of the global financial system simply because a U.S. executive agency filed an internal memo.
Yes.
It's the ultimate weaponization of the U.S. legal system. It's a strategy of pure defensive hegemony.
Defensive hegemony is the perfect term for it. The United States understands it can no longer outmanufacture China. So it leverages the two massive structural advantages it still retains, its incredibly lucrative domestic consumer market, and its sprawling, globally recognized legal borders.
If you want to play, you play by our rules.
Right. If a foreign company wants to sell its products to the wealthiest consumers on Earth or access the dollar system, they must comply entirely with U.S. intellectual property interpretations and U.S. supply chain dictates. We see this mirrored in the USTR's Special 301 report, too.
Right, the Special 301, which monitors global trading partners and effectively coerces them into adopting TRIPS Plus standards. Give me a quick ELF5 on TRIPS Plus.
Sure. So TRIPS is the foundational World Trade Organization Agreement on Intellectual Property. TRIPS Plus refers to extra demands made by the U.S. in bilateral trade agreements.
Like pushing the baseline higher.
Exactly. It forces other nations to implement IP protections that go far beyond standard WTO rules, usually extending patent lifespans or tightening data exclusivity in ways that heavily favor massive American pharmaceutical and tech monopolies.
A classic example is data exclusivity in pharmaceuticals or agriculture. So under basic WTO rules, a patent lasts for 20 years. Once it expires, generic manufacturers can use the original clinical trial data to prove their generic version is safe and bring cheap alternatives to market.
Right, which is how we get affordable generic drugs.
Exactly. But under TRIPS Plus provisions enforced by the USTR, the U.S. demands data exclusivity. This means that even after the patent expires, the generic company cannot rely on the original test data for an additional 5 to 10 years.
Wait, really? So they would have to redo the trials?
They would have to run their own multi-million-dollar clinical trials, which they obviously can't afford.
So it's just a legal mechanism to artificially extend a monopoly long after the actual patent has died.
Exactly. It's often called evergreening. And why does the U.S. do this? Because the U.S. economy has transitioned to become highly dependent on intellectual property rents. So the U.S. is building this massive fortress, setting the legal terms of entry, and demanding everyone play by their rules. But, this sounds like a street fight where everyone is looking for an angle. While UFLPA blocks physical goods and PIPA attacks corporations, this third blockade focuses on stopping the flow of knowledge itself. This is the SAFE Act of 2025.
The Securing American Funding and Expertise from Adversarial Research Exploitation Act. Quite a mouthful.
Yes. The U.S. realized that its open, highly collaborative, academic and research environment, the very environment that fueled its 20th century dominance, was being utilized by strategic competitors to catch up. The SAFE Act is designed to aggressively halt the bleeding of American R&D.
But how does it actually enforce that? How do you stop scientists from talking to each other across borders?
By targeting the lifeblood of academic research, funding.
Of course.
The SAFE Act explicitly cuts off federal STEM grants, science, technology, engineering, and math funding to any scientist or institution with a history of collaborating with hostile nations.
And the sources note it specifically targets joint programs with China's 7 Sons of National Defense. Who are the 7 Sons?
The 7 Sons are a group of elite Chinese universities that focus heavily on military and defense research, things like aerospace, submarine engineering, automation, and advanced materials.
Okay, so heavy defense tech.
Right. For years, there were robust, open academic partnerships between prestigious U.S. institutions and these universities. Knowledge flowed freely in the name of global scientific advancement. The SAFE Act brutally severs those ties.
So you can't work with them at all anymore.
Exactly. It mandates that any researcher partnering with these entities or even accepting overlapping grants will lose their U.S. federal funding. It forces a loyalty test on global R&D, attempting to build an impermeable wall around American intellectual capital. If the U.S. is using its legal system as a fortress, foreign competitors must be actively trying to breach those walls.
Oh, absolutely. They aren't just going to sit back and take the PIPA sanctions lying down.
Right. They are actively breaching the walls. And one of the most fascinating covert tactics being used to infiltrate the U.S. legal fortress is third-party litigation funding, or TPLF.
This is such a critical piece of the puzzle.
Now, I've heard TPLF described as using the U.S. legal system as a casino, but having read the mechanics from the sources, that feels like a terrible metaphor. A casino implies random luck. This sounds much more like a Trojan horse.
It is entirely a Trojan horse, and a highly structured one at that. Traditionally, third-party litigation funding is a mechanism where outside investors bankroll a plaintiff's lawsuit in exchange for a percentage of the final financial settlement.
Like funding a class action suit.
Right. It has actually grown into a massive $16.1 billion industry in the United States, mostly funding class actions or personal injury torts. But foreign states and strategic competitors have realized they can weaponize this financial vehicle.
How so?
They can anonymously fund massive patent infringement lawsuits against major U.S. tech companies.
I want to break down the mechanics of this infiltration because it's brilliant in a terrifying way. Let's say a foreign government secretly pays a shell company, who then pays an American law firm, to sue an American tech giant for patent infringement. Why? What is the actual geopolitical goal? Is it just to drain the American company's legal budget?
Distraction and financial drain are certainly ancillary benefits. Tying up American tech executives in endless depositions slows down their R&D momentum, obviously. But the real geopolitical prize is the discovery process.
The discovery process, meaning the phase of a lawsuit where both sides have to legally show each other their evidence.
Exactly. During federal litigation in the United States, the discovery rules are incredibly broad. Defendants can be legally compelled by a federal judge to produce millions of internal documents, proprietary executive communications, engineering schematics, and even highly sensitive foundational source code.
Let me get this straight. If I'm a foreign competitor, I don't need to hack into the American company's servers. I don't need to hire spies to steal the source code. I just secretly fund a patent troll to sue them in a federal court in Texas.
Yep.
And then the U.S. judicial system, utilizing its own rules of discovery, physically forces the American company to hand over its most sensitive secrets directly to the plaintiff's lawyers.
It is a stunning exploitation of the system's transparency. The foreign entity uses the rules of the fortress against the people inside it.
That is mind-blowing.
And this isn't a theoretical threat, by the way. There was a highly illuminating case recently involving a Shenzhen-based company called Purplevine IP.
Walk me through the Purplevine case. What exactly happened there?
Purplevine IP was discovered to be secretly bankrolling a massive patent litigation campaign against Samsung Electronics in U.S. federal courts.
Okay, Samsung is South Korean, but they're using U.S. courts.
Right. The operation was incredibly opaque, layered behind various corporate entities. The only reason it was brought to light was because a specific U.S. judge became suspicious of the funding structures. The judge actually explicitly ordered the plaintiff to disclose its true origins and financial backers.
So a Chinese entity was secretly funding a lawsuit against a South Korean tech giant inside an American courtroom to utilize the American discovery process.
Precisely. It perfectly illustrated the vulnerability of the U.S. judicial system to foreign manipulation. This is exactly why the U.S. Congress is currently pushing back aggressively with proposed legislation like the Protecting Our Courts from Foreign Manipulation Act of 2023.
What does that act actually do?
The bill aims to fundamentally ban foreign sovereign wealth funds and state-affiliated entities from bankrolling litigation in U.S. courts entirely. And it forces mandatory disclosure of all third-party funding in federal cases.
It is a constant escalating arms race of legal maneuvers. But taking a step back, I have to question the long-term viability of this whole strategy. Building this massive, aggressive enforcement stack, deploying PAIPA without judges, using the UFLPA to block supply chains, is this actually a good idea for the U.S. in the long run?
That is the core debate among trade analysts right now. While it provides a formidable short-term defense, it carries severe, destabilizing long-term risks.
Because of the precedent it sets.
Absolutely. Right. Take PAIPA's lack of judicial oversight, for instance. By allowing the executive branch to arbitrarily sanction a foreign company for alleged IP theft without presenting public evidence, you are essentially judicializing trade policy.
It replaces a predictable, rules-based trade order with discretionary tit-for-tat economic warfare.
And it makes the global business environment incredibly volatile. If Washington can arbitrarily drop the hammer on a foreign tech firm, it virtually guarantees that third countries will rapidly retaliate against American citizens, executives, and corporations operating abroad.
They'll just invent their own version of PAIPA.
Right. It creates an environment of mutually assured destruction in the realm of global trade.
So we have this intricate, heavily fortified U.S. legal architecture of trade compliance, border seizures, and zero-trial sanctions. If you are sitting in the global south or you are a developing BRICS nation, you are looking at this fortress and thinking, we absolutely cannot play by these rules. We need to build a bypass.
They have to. They literally cannot afford the compliance.
So how are these nations attempting to coordinate an end run around this U.S. legal enforcement stack?
This brings us to the BRICS plus counter-architecture. Recognizing that they cannot win a legal war inside U.S. courts or at U.S. customs borders, the Global South is engaged in a very deliberate, accelerated push to construct entirely parallel financial alternatives.
Alternatives that are structurally insulated from U.S. jurisdiction?
Exactly. Two of the most critical projects in this space are the mBridge platform and the BRICS Pay messaging system.
Let's focus on mBridge, because I know it involves central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. We're talking about state-backed crypto ledgers. Give me the mechanical breakdown of how mBridge actually circumvents the old petrodollar system we discussed earlier.
To understand the bypass, you have to understand the old choke point. In the traditional system, if a company in Brazil wants to buy goods from a company in China, the payment usually has to be routed in U.S. dollars through a correspondent bank located in New York using the SWIFT messaging system.
Right, because international banking isn't peer-to-peer. The money physically hops through correspondent banks.
Yes, and because that transaction touches a server in New York, it falls under U.S. jurisdiction. The U.S. Treasury can monitor it, freeze it, or sanction it.
So New York is the toll booth.
Exactly. mBridge is a multi-CBDC platform developed jointly by the Bank for International Settlements Innovation Hub and several central banks, including the central banks of China, the UAE, Hong Kong, and Thailand.
Okay, so it's a joint venture. What makes it so revolutionary?
What makes mBridge revolutionary is that it enables real-time, peer-to-peer, cross-border payments directly between participating central banks.
Using a shared blockchain ledger.
Yes. If a trade is settled instantly on a blockchain ledger shared exclusively between Beijing and Abu Dhabi using a digital unit of account or local currencies, that transaction never routes through New York. It never touches a correspondent bank.
It's just a direct digital handshake.
Therefore, it is entirely invisible and untouchable by U.S. sanctions law.
And the geopolitical earthquake here is the recent inclusion of major energy producers into these digital infrastructure projects. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are deeply involved.
That is the paradigm shift. If you can settle massive billion-dollar energy trades instantly on a blockchain without touching the U.S. banking system, you have effectively neutralized the traditional petrodollar loop.
The loop is broken.
For many analysts in the global south, this represents the dawn of true financial sovereignty. It is the decoupling of global economic development from the dictates of U.S. foreign policy.
Okay, I hear the theory of financial sovereignty. It sounds clean, but I'm going to actively challenge this utopian view of a frictionless digital BRICS plus bypass. Because here is the resolution to the paradox we started this entire deep dive with: the cargo ship stuck at the port.
Ah, right, the paradox.
You might successfully bypass the currency using BRICS Pay or mBridge. You can build your secret digital tunnel to move the money perfectly, but patent enforcement and trade compliance are inherently territorial.
Walk through how that territorial reality asserts itself against the digital bypass.
Well, you can use BRICS Pay, completely bypassing New York, to buy a massive shipment of those record-breaking LONGi solar panels we talked about earlier. The money moves perfectly on the blockchain. But those panels are physical objects made of glass, aluminum, and polysilicon.
They exist in the real world.
Exactly. They have to exist in the real world. If a company wants to install those panels in a massive utility-scale project in Texas, or even in a U.S. allied nation in Europe that honors U.S. intellectual property treaties, those physical goods have to cross a physical terrestrial border.
And that terrestrial border is governed entirely by domestic law, backed by the state's monopoly on violence.
Exactly. If those solar panels contain polysilicon that a customs agent suspects violates the UFLPA, or if the technology inside the panel infringes on a foundational U.S. patent, the United States International Trade Commission, the USITC, can utilize Section 337 to authorize customs to seize the goods right at the dock.
Just impound them.
It does not matter if you paid for the panels with mBridge, Bitcoin, digital yuan, or physical gold bars. The secret digital tunnel only moves the digits. The physical goods still have to face the customs firewall.
That is the defining tension of the current era. The financial rails of the global economy are becoming rapidly decentralized, digital, and borderless. But the legal enforcement of intellectual property and supply chain morality remains deeply, stubbornly territorial.
It's fascinating. So let's look at this from the perspective of a CEO, just a business leader trapped in this geopolitical crossfire. On one side, you have the BRICS plus financial bypass and China's absolute manufacturing monopoly. You need their cheap tech to survive.
You can't afford the 41-cent panels.
Right. On the other side, you have the U.S. legal fortress, the UFLPA, and the threat of zero-trial PAIPA sanctions. What are the actual survival strategies for a company operating in 2026? How do you do business?
The survival strategies are heavily dependent on the size and capitalization of the company. The tactics used to navigate this crossfire have become incredibly complex, honestly bordering on corporate espionage.
Okay, give me an example. Let's look at pre-Series A startups, the early-stage tech companies.
Their primary survival strategy right now is extreme corporate obfuscation and delaying visibility.
Wait, what does delaying visibility mean for a startup? Usually a startup wants as much visibility as possible to attract investors, right? PR is everything.
Not anymore. If you are developing cutting-edge tech, say in quantum sensing or advanced AI, early visibility is a death sentence. Startups are terrifyingly aware of cap table contamination.
Cap table contamination, meaning the government scrutinizes who gave you your early seed money.
Exactly. If a U.S. startup takes early seed funding from a venture capital firm that has even indirect ties to Chinese state capital, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, can step in.
And what can CFIUS do?
They can block further funding rounds or even force the foreign investors to divest, which completely destroys the startup's momentum. So startups use complex offshore holding companies, often incorporating in jurisdictions like the Cayman Islands or Singapore,
To hide the money trail.
to mask beneficial ownership and sanitize their cap tables before Western regulators can scrutinize them.
And what about their R&D? Do they aggressively patent their early breakthroughs to protect themselves? That's the traditional Silicon Valley playbook.
No, they are actually doing the exact opposite. Pre-Series A startups are increasingly relying on trade secrets rather than filing formal patents.
Wait, really? Why wouldn't you want a patent?
Remember our discussion about third-party litigation funding, the Trojan horse?
Oh.
Yeah. If a small startup files a patent for a revolutionary piece of quantum tech, they just publish a roadmap of their technology to the world. They pin a massive target on their back.
Because they don't have the money to defend it.
Exactly. They become an instant target for a foreign-funded patent troll who will sue them just to trigger the discovery process and extract the underlying source code. So they keep the tech completely dark as a trade secret until they have the massive legal war chest required to actually defend a patent in federal court.
So the geopolitical environment is actually discouraging public innovation. That is incredibly dark. What about the funded scale-ups, the massive multinationals who are already established? How do they survive the crossfire?
They utilize a strategy of mutually assured destruction, specifically leveraging standard essential patents, or SEPs.
Okay, we need to break down the mechanics of a standard essential patent. How does an SEP differ from a normal patent?
A normal patent might cover a specific feature, like the design of a phone's camera lens.
Yeah.
A standard essential patent covers the fundamental technology required to comply with a global industry standard, like 5G cellular communication or Wi-Fi.
So it's foundational.
Very. If you want to build a smartphone that connects to a 5G network, you mathematically must use the technology covered by these SEPs. You have no alternative choice.
And because that creates an insane monopoly, the companies that own these SEPs have to agree to license them fairly, right? Otherwise, they could just hold the whole world hostage.
Yes. When tech companies collaborate at global standards bodies, like the IEEA or ETSI, to define how 5G will actually work, they agree to license their SEPs on FRAND terms.
FRAND. What does that stand for?
That stands for fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory.
But I'm guessing fair and reasonable is highly subjective when geopolitics gets involved.
Immensely subjective. And this is where China is forcefully asserting its legal sovereignty. We are seeing Chinese courts actively stepping in to set global FRAND rates.
Like dictating global prices from a local court.
Exactly. A landmark example was the Oppo versus Nokia case. Nokia, a European company, held vital 5G SEPs and demanded a certain royalty rate from Oppo, which is a massive Chinese smartphone manufacturer.
And Oppo didn't want to pay it.
Right. So a Chinese court stepped in, asserted global jurisdiction over the patent dispute, and set a FRAND rate that effectively gave Oppo a 61% discount on the royalties Nokia was demanding.
A 61% discount dictated by a Chinese court on a European company's intellectual property. That is a massive power play.
And if Nokia refused the Chinese court's rate, they risked being entirely locked out of the Chinese consumer market or facing injunctions against their products. We saw this previously with the IWN-COMM versus Apple case too.
What happened there?
That was the first time a Chinese court granted an ESEB injunction against a massive foreign tech giant, actually halting sales to force compliance with Chinese IP demands.
It really is mutually assured destruction. Comply with the U.S. ITC border seizures or face Chinese court injunctions and be placed on Beijing's unreliable entity list.
You're squeezed from both sides.
Which brings up a critical existential question about this entire global portfolio of strategies. Think about the sheer affordability of operating in this environment.
The overhead is absolutely staggering.
I mean, a company now has to maintain split supply chains, one completely compliant with U.S. laws, one for the rest of the world. They have to fight multi-jurisdictional patent wars simultaneously in Texas and Shenzhen.
And pay the top-tier lawyers in both places.
Right. They have to map their entire global supply chain down to the molecular quartz level to prove UFLPA compliance to a customs agent. They need an army of trade lawyers, compliance auditors, and supply chain software engineers just to ship a single solar panel. Can any normal company actually afford to play this game?
That is the tragic structural irony of this new era. The legal mechanisms designed to protect innovation, The patents, the export controls, the supply chain compliance regimes, they have become so incredibly burdensome and weaponized that they serve as an impenetrable barrier to entry.
Only the giants survive.
The system now absolutely favors massive, vertically integrated behemoths like Saudi Aramco or heavily state-backed national champions in China. The sheer cost of navigating the geopolitical legal landscape is completely pricing smaller innovators out of the market entirely.
So innovation actually slows down.
Well, if a company is spending 60% of its budget on legal compliance and litigation defense instead of actual research and development, global innovation drastically slows down, yeah.
Okay, let's take a breath and recap this incredible journey we've been on, because we have covered a massive amount of geopolitical ground today. We started by looking at the historic transition from the petrodollar system, where global power was enforced by oil priced in U.S. currency and recycled into U.S. debt, to this new fragmented patent dollar reality.
Right. We examined the hard R&D data. We saw how legacy oil giants like Saudi Aramco are pivoting rapidly toward digital microgrid patents, while China utilized the ruthless crucible of domestic involution to capture 65% of global solar patents, establishing an absolute monopoly on the raw materials and the high-efficiency perovskite future.
We explored how the United States, realizing it absolutely cannot outmanufacture the 9-cent Chinese solar module, has built a defensive legal fortress instead. They are weaponizing the customs border with the UFLPA's impossible rebuttable presumption standards and threatening zero-trial economic exile through PIPA.
And we analyzed the clandestine infiltration of that exact fortress through third-party litigation funding. The BRICS push for true financial sovereignty via digital ledgers like mBridge, and the desperate survival strategies of companies caught in the crossfire of mutually assured destruction, battling over standard essential patents.
So why does all of this complex legal and financial architecture matter to you, the listener? Because the world is changing at a velocity that the old maps can no longer track. The next time you turn on the news and hear about a geopolitical conflict, a new trade tariff, or a cargo seizure at a shipping port, you will know to look past the physical goods.
Don't just follow the physical money on the blockchain either.
Right. Follow the IP. Patents, supply chain provenance, and trade compliance are the new reserve currency.
Understanding that structural shift is really the only way to accurately read the 21st century economy.
And that leads me to one final, deeply provocative question for you to mull over, a thought experiment that builds directly on the tension we've unpacked today. Let's assume the Global South is entirely successful in their mission.
Okay, a complete win for BRICS.
They achieve absolute financial sovereignty via the BRICS plus digital rails. They bypass the New York correspondent banks entirely. Their digital ledgers are flawless. But what if the United States and its closest Western allies aggressively secure and hold all the foundational intellectual property for quantum computing and advanced artificial general intelligence?
Because you absolutely need quantum-resistant encryption to secure those new digital ledgers.
Yes. And you need AGI to manage and optimize those decentralized global networks.
It creates a technological bottleneck at the absolute highest level of computing.
Exactly. If the Global South successfully bypasses the US dollar, but they are mathematically forced to pay a massive recurring IP licensing fee to an American tech giant just for the quantum software required to turn their digital financial system on, who really holds the reserve currency?
That is the ultimate paradox of the patent dollar era.
Something to keep you up at night. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Keep questioning the surface-level narratives of global finance, and we will see you next time.